The white dress was not supposed to matter. That was what I told myself as I smoothed the fabric over my arms for the third time that morning, standing in front of a mirror that had witnessed far too many versions of me. The frightened girl, the obedient wife, the hollow woman who learned to smile while breaking apart from the inside. This mirror, in the small cottage I had made my own over the past 3 years, had seen all of them. And now it showed me someone I almost didn't recognize. Ellie Voss, 26 years old. Blonde hair braided loosely over one shoulder, the pale strands catching the thin morning light that pushed through the curtains like something uncertain, like it wasn't sure it was welcome either. Pale gray eyes, a face that had learned stillness the hard way, and a white dress, simple linen, modest, nothing ceremonial about it, that I had chosen without thinking twice, because the morning was warm, and I was tired of choosing things based on what they might mean to someone else. I had spent 3 years unlearning that habit. 3 years since the council chambers of Veldrath Keep, where I had stood before the Alpha King and his advisors and listened to the dissolution of our union read aloud like a list of inventory. The bond is hereby severed. The Omega is released from all obligations to the crown. I remembered the way the words had landed. Not like a blow, but like a quiet door closing. Final. Bloodless. The kind of ending that doesn't announce itself with fire, but with a silence so complete you can hear it long after the room empties. I had not cried. I had not spoken. I had simply walked out. And I had kept walking, all the way here, to the village of Ashfan, tucked into the eastern foothills of the Veldrath territory, where the pines grew so thick in winter that the sky became a rumor, and where nobody cared who you had once been married to. Here, I had learned to tend herbs. I had learned to be useful in small, quiet ways, healing minor ailments, assisting the elder healer Marin, becoming part of a place at the pace of seasons rather than commands. Here, I had become, slowly and painfully, someone I recognized. But today was the Accord Gathering. Every 3 years, the packs of the Northern Territories convened at neutral ground. This year, the open valley just beyond Ashfan's eastern ridge, to renew alliances, settle disputes, and reaffirm the Alpha King's authority over the unified packs. It was tradition. It was obligation. And Ashfan, small as it was required to send representatives, because Ashfan sat on the border of 3 pack territories, and its healer always attended to ensure the gathering proceeded without incident. Marin had sprained her ankle 2 days ago. I was going in her place. I told myself, standing at that mirror, that it didn't matter, that the gathering was large. Hundreds of wolves, dozens of delegations, enough noise and motion to swallow one quiet woman whole. That Darius would be surrounded by his council, his generals, his new advisors. That 3 years was a long time. That he probably wouldn't even notice me. I picked up my healer's satchel, worn leather, smelling of dried lavender and pine resin, and walked out the door before I could change my mind. The valley was already alive with sound by the time I crested the ridge. Tents and banners stretched across the flat land below in organized chaos, each pack's colors staked into the earth like small declarations. The air smelled of cook fires and pine smoke and something animal and wild underneath it all. The particular scent of a gathering of wolves. Not unpleasant, but layered, dense, like a forest after rain when everything releases what it has been holding. Children ran between the tents. Warriors stood in loose clusters, trading the careful, measuring looks that always preceded formal alliances. A low horn sounded somewhere in the distance, signaling another delegation's arrival. I descended the path with my satchel over one shoulder, keeping to the edges, moving the way I had taught myself to move in Ashfan, quietly, purposefully, like someone who belongs without demanding acknowledgement of it. Sarah found me before I'd made it 20 steps into the valley. She materialized from behind a supply tent, taller than me by half a head, with dark skin and close-cropped hair, and the kind of steady gaze that always made me feel simultaneously seen and safe. Sarah was the healer's assistant from the Grayfen pack, and she had been my closest friend for the past 2 years, ever since she'd arrived in Ashven for a season of training with Marin and simply stayed a little longer each time she visited. "You're actually here," she said, and there was something in her voice that wasn't quite surprise, something careful. "Marin's ankle," I reminded her. "I know about Marin's ankle." She fell into step beside me without being asked, which was one of the things I valued most about her. "I also know about the delegation from Veldrath Keep arriving this morning." I didn't answer immediately. I adjusted the strap of my satchel and watched a group of young wolves from the Northern Harrow pack attempting to erect a banner pole that was clearly too long for the stakes they'd brought. "It's his gathering," I said finally. "He'll be here. That's not news. Ellie. Sarah." She stopped walking, which meant I stopped too, because Sarah had a gravity to her that was hard to argue with. She looked at me with those steady eyes and said, very quietly, "I need you to be prepared, because I saw the advance riders this morning, and I need you to know before you walk into that main tent." Something cold moved through me. Not fear, exactly. More like the particular sensation of a wound you thought had closed, reminding you it hadn't. "Know what?" I asked. She hesitated for only a second. "He came alone. No council companion, no announced partnership." She paused again. "People are saying the Second Alliance negotiations fell through, that he refused the Northern Lord's daughter." I absorbed this. The noise of the valley continued around us. The horn, the children, the crack of tent poles going up. And I stood in the middle of it and felt something I had no name for. Something that was not hope, because I had dismantled hope 3 years ago very carefully and methodically, brick by brick, until there was nothing left to fall. "That has nothing to do with me," I said. Sarah nodded, but her eyes said something different. We walked on. The main tent was the largest structure in the valley, a great circular canopy of dark canvas, open at the sides, where the formal proceedings would take place at midday. In the hours before, it served as a common gathering point, the space where delegations greeted each other and healers set up their stations along the perimeter. I found my assigned corner quickly, unfolded the table Marin had arranged for me, and began laying out supplies with the focused attention of someone who needed their hands to be busy. Feverfew, willow bark, calendula salve, the small tools of quiet, useful work. I was reaching for the second bundle of dried herbs when the tent went still. Not completely still. There was still sound, still movement, still the low hum of a gathering in motion. But something shifted, the way a forest shifts when a larger creature enters it. The conversations didn't stop exactly. They simply rearranged themselves, lowered in pitch, leaned in different directions. I knew without looking up what had caused it. I kept my eyes on the herbs. I counted the bundles. I focused on the smell of lavender and the texture of the dried stems between my fingers and the simple, grounding reality of the table in front of me. And then I heard his voice. Not words, just the register of it, that particular low frequency I had spent years learning to read for danger or for weather, or for the rare moments when something behind it softened. It moved through the tent from the entrance, not loud, not commanding in any performed way, just present, the way gravity is present, the way you don't choose whether to feel it. I was not going to look up. I was absolutely, definitively not going to look up. The tent shifted again, and I looked up. He stood at the entrance, flanked by 2 of his senior generals. I recognized Kale on the left, gray-bearded and watchful, unchanged. And he was scanning the tent the way he always had, that slow, systematic assessment that took in every corner before settling anywhere. He wore leather and dark fur against the morning chill, travel clothes rather than formal regalia, and his black hair was braided back in the warrior style he preferred when ceremony hadn't yet begun. He looked the same. 3 years, and he looked exactly the same. And something about that was profoundly unfair in a way I didn't have language for. His gaze moved across the tent, and then it stopped. It stopped on me. And Darius, the Alpha King, the man who had dissolved our union in a council chamber without once raising his voice, went completely, utterly still. The kind of still that has nothing to do with calm. I did not move. I think, in that moment, I forgot how to. The lavender bundle was still in my hands, and I was gripping it too tightly. I could feel the dried stems pressing into my palm, the faint release of scent that came with pressure, that particular sharp sweetness that usually steadied me. It wasn't steadying me now. Nothing was steadying me now, because Darius was still looking at me with that expression I had never seen on his face before. Not in 3 years of marriage, and not in the cold, formal proceedings of our dissolution, and I did not know what to do with it. He recovered first. Of course he did. He was the Alpha King. Recovery was something he had been trained for, the way other men were trained for combat. Fast, controlled, leaving no visible evidence of the disruption that had caused it. His gaze moved on, continuing its scan of the tent, as if it had merely paused on me the way it paused on everything, cataloging and releasing. He said something to Kale. Kale nodded. They moved toward the central table where the pack representatives were already gathering for the preliminary greetings. I looked back down at my herbs. My hands were not entirely steady. Sarah appeared at my elbow without a word, and handed me a cup of something warm. Tea from the communal fire, pine-smoked and slightly too bitter, the kind of thing you drink not because it tastes good, but because the act of holding something warm is itself a form of reassurance. I accepted it without looking at her. He froze, she said quietly. I noticed. Ellie, he genuinely... Sarah. I set the cup down and reached for the calendula salve, unscrewing the lid, checking the consistency with a deliberate focus that was entirely performance. I am here to work. That is all I'm here for. She was quiet for a moment, then... Of course. But I could feel her watching me, the way she always watched when she thought I was about to make the particular mistake of pretending that something didn't matter when it clearly did. The morning proceeded. That was the thing about formal gatherings. They had their own momentum, their own architecture of obligation that moved people through hours without asking their permission. I tended to 3 minor complaints before midday. A young warrior from the southern Ashevale pack with a bad blister on his heel from new boots, an elder delegate whose joints ached from the cold morning ride, and a child, no more than 7, with a cut on her palm from a tent stake, who sat very bravely on my table and only flinched once when I cleaned and wrapped the wound. Her mother hovered anxiously nearby, a woman from the Grafen pack with Sarah's same steady eyes, and I smiled at her the way Marin had taught me to smile, not with teeth, but with the whole face, something that said I have done this before, and it will be fine, and watched the tension leave her shoulders. This was what I was good at. This quiet, practical reassurance. This being useful in ways that didn't require me to be anything other than present and competent. I was thinking about this, about competence as armor, about how I had rebuilt myself piece by piece into someone defined by what she could do rather than what she had been. When I became aware that someone was standing at the edge of my station, not a patient. The posture was wrong for someone seeking help. Too still, too deliberate, the kind of standing that is actually waiting. I looked up. It was not Darius. It was Kale. The old general looked exactly as he always had. Silver-bearded, sharp-eyed, with the particular weathered quality of a man who had spent decades in service to something larger than himself. He had always been kind to me, in his reserved way, during the years at Veldrath Keep. Not demonstrative, not warm in any performed sense, but fair, which had meant more than warmth in those years. Healer Voss, he said. His voice was the same too, low, measured, each word placed with the care of someone who had learned long ago that words had consequences. General Kale. I kept my voice equally even. Are you injured? No. He glanced toward the table, at the neatly arranged supplies, and something crossed his face that I couldn't immediately read. I heard Marin was unable to attend. She'll recover well. It was only a sprain. Good. A pause. Ashvin suits you. The observation was so quiet and so genuine that it caught me slightly off guard. I looked at him more directly, trying to read the intent behind it, and found nothing that looked like strategy or message carrying. Just an old man saying something he meant. It does, I said honestly. I've been fortunate. He nodded slowly. Then, the Alpha King was not informed of the healer substitution. There it was. I held his gaze. The substitution was arranged through Ashven's village council and the gathering's coordination committee. It followed proper procedure. Yes, Kale said. It did. Another pause, longer this time. He was simply unprepared. I didn't know what to do with that word, unprepared. I turned it over in my mind while I pretended to straighten the supplies that were already straight, and I thought about the moment in the tent when Darius had gone still, and I thought about all the things that word could mean, and all the things it couldn't. General, I said carefully, I'm not sure why you're telling me this. Curiosity, he said, with something that might have been the edge of a wry smile. Or perhaps honesty. I have been in service to the crown for 31 years. I have learned to distinguish between a man who is indifferent and a man who is working very hard to appear indifferent. He straightened, the almost smile fading back into his usual gravity. The afternoon session begins at the second horn. There is a formal healer's presentation as part of the proceedings. You'll be expected to stand with the other attending healers near the eastern pillar. I know the protocol, I said. I know you do. He dipped his head, a small, genuine gesture of respect, and walked back toward the center of the tent. I stood very still for a moment after he left, my hand resting on the edge of the table. He was simply unprepared. The afternoon session was everything formal gatherings always were. Structured, slow, heavy with the weight of tradition. The great canopy had been fully opened on all sides by the time the second horn sounded, allowing the cool afternoon air to move through, carrying the smell of pine and distant rain. The pack representatives arranged themselves in the concentric half-circle that protocol dictated, healers along the eastern edge, warriors behind their respective delegates, elders given the innermost positions of honor. I stood where Kale had told me to stand, between an older woman from the Harrow pack who smelled of rosemary and a young male healer from Ashvale who kept shifting his weight nervously and was clearly at his first major gathering. I gave him a small nod when he caught my eye, and he seemed to steady slightly. Darius entered from the northern approach, the formal entrance, reserved for the presiding authority, and the gathered assembly shifted the way it always did when he entered a space. Not from fear, exactly, though the power behind it was real. More from the particular gravity that certain people carry, the kind that rearranges the air around them. He wore formal regalia now. Dark leather reinforced at the shoulders, the Veldrath crest worked into the chest plate. His black hair still braided but with the small iron and obsidian clasp that marked his rank. He looked like what he was, the most powerful alpha in the Northern Territories, a man who had held 7 packs in alignment through both strategy and presence for 6 years. He also looked, in the brief, unguarded moment before he settled into the authority of the ceremony, like he hadn't slept well. I noticed that. I noticed it, and told myself not to. The formal proceedings moved through their stages. The reading of the accord renewal, the acknowledgement of each pack's representative, the settling of 2 minor territorial disputes that had been submitted in advance. I watched and listened with the focused attention I applied to everything, cataloging information the way Marin had taught me, understanding that a healer at a gathering was always also an observer, always gathering context that might matter later. Darius presided over all of it with the control that was his particular gift. Absolute, seemingly effortless, the kind of authority that comes not from domination, but from an unshakable certainty about one's own judgment. He spoke precisely. He listened with genuine attention. He resolved the territorial disputes with a fairness that I recognized. The same fairness I had once watched him apply to everything, the quality that had first made me believe, years ago, that there was more to him than power. I had not been wrong about that. I had simply been wrong about other things. The ceremony reached the healer's acknowledgement, a brief, formal recognition of those serving the gathering. The lead delegate called each healer's name and home territory, and we each stepped forward in turn. A small bow, a moment of recognition, then back to position. Ellie Voss, healer's representative of Ashfin Village, Eastern Veldrath border territory. I stepped forward. And in the half-second that followed, in the small, ordinary space between my name being called and my feet carrying me the 2 steps forward and back, I felt it. The weight of his attention. Not a glance. Not the cataloging sweep he gave everything. Something different. Something that had a quality of duration to it. That lasted a beat longer than ceremony required. That existed in the space between formal acknowledgement and something else entirely. I did not look at him. I stepped forward. I bowed. I stepped back. But my heart was doing something complicated and unwelcome in my chest, and the young healer beside me gave me a sideways look that suggested my composure was not quite as complete as I intended it to be. Then, from across the gathered assembly, one of the Eastern delegates leaned toward his neighbor, and I caught, just barely, carried on the afternoon air, the low murmur of his words. "Is that not the king's former?" The rest was lost in the sound of the wind and the gathering's ambient noise. But the damage was done. The whisper moved through the outer edges of the assembly in that particular way that whispers always do at formal events, quietly, quickly, and with devastating efficiency. And I understood, standing there in my white dress with my healer's satchel over my shoulder, that regardless of what I had planned or told myself or carefully arranged inside my own mind, the afternoon was not going to be simple. It was not going to be simple at all. The whisper had a life of its own after that. I had learned, during my years at Veldrath Keep, that information in a formal gathering moved the way water moves through cracked stone, finding every gap, widening it, traveling paths you would never have predicted until suddenly it was everywhere, and the crack had become something structural. I had learned to be neither the source nor the subject of such movement. I had learned to be the woman standing quietly at the edge of the room, the one people forgot to watch. I had apparently forgotten how to be invisible. By the time the formal ceremony concluded, and the gathering dissolved into the informal afternoon hours, the meals shared between delegations, the quieter negotiations conducted over food and fire, I could feel the awareness following me the way a shadow follows, constant and without malice, simply a consequence of light falling in a particular direction. People looked, not rudely. Wolves at a formal gathering had too much training and protocol for open staring, but they looked in that practiced, peripheral way, quick glances that slid away the moment I turned toward them. I heard my name once more, detached from any sentence, floating free on the air near the Harrow delegation's meal area. I heard the word divorced in the particular hushed tone people reserve for things they find both scandalous and fascinating. I kept moving. I found the edge of the valley where the tree line began, where the sound of the gathering softened to a manageable hum, and I sat on a flat rock with my satchel across my knees and ate the bread and dried meat that Sarah had pressed on me before I'd walked away from the main tent. And I looked at the pines and breathed. In, out. The smell of resin and cold air and distance. This was the other thing Ashfin had taught me. How to find the still point. How to locate, inside whatever noise was happening around or within me, the small, quiet center that belonged entirely to me and could not be touched by what others thought or said or whispered. Morin had not taught me this explicitly. It was more absorbed than instructed. Something that came from watching an old woman move through her work with complete self-possession, completely unrattled by the opinions of the people she served. "You are not what they call you," Morin had said once. Not to me specifically, but to the room in general, the way she said most of her important things. You are what you do when no one is watching. I sat with that for a while. I was still sitting with it when Sarah arrived, slightly breathless, and settled onto the rock beside me, with the unceremonious ease of someone who had long since decided that physical comfort in a friendship mattered more than dignity. "The Harrow Elder wants a compress for her shoulder before the evening fire," she said. "I told her you'd come by her tent in an hour. Is that acceptable?" "Of course." "Good." She reached over and took a piece of my bread without asking, which was very Sarah. "Also, Cale has been moving through the delegations, very calmly, very deliberately, shutting down the conversation wherever it appears to be going in the direction of your name." I looked at her. "Cale is?" "With the particular efficiency of a man who has been given a task and intends to complete it." She met my eyes. "He wasn't acting on his own initiative, Ellie." The still point I had found was suddenly harder to locate. "That doesn't mean anything," I said. "It means he asked Cale to manage it. Darius doesn't send Cale to do things that don't matter to him. He's managing optics. It's a formal gathering. Gossip about the former..." I stopped, tried again. "Gossip about a dissolved union reflects poorly on the authority of the proceedings. He would want to control that regardless." Sarah looked at me for a long moment with the expression she wore when she was deciding whether to argue or let something sit. She let it sit. But she stayed beside me, her shoulder warm against mine, and we watched the tree line together while the gathering hummed behind us, and I was grateful, deeply, plainly grateful, that she was there. The Harrow Elder's tent was warm and smelled of beeswax candles and the particular dried herb mixture the northern packs favored for their bedding, something astringent and clean, like crushed juniper. Elder Wynne was a small woman, with iron-gray hair and eyes so pale they were nearly colorless, and she had the particular quality of stillness that came not from peace, but from an entire lifetime of watching and calculating. She let me work on her shoulder without speaking for several minutes, a deep compression ache from old cartilage damage, the kind that flared in cold weather. And I applied the warming salve Marin had taught me to make, and worked through the tissue with careful, practiced pressure, and felt the small ways her breathing changed as the pain eased. "You trained with Marin," Wynne said. Not a question. "For 3 years. She's the finest healer in the Eastern Territories, possibly all territories." The elder's pale eyes tracked to me, assessing. "She doesn't take many students. She said she was tired of training people who left." I kept my hands moving, steady and rhythmic. I had nowhere to go. Wynne was quiet for a moment. Then, with the directness of someone who had reached an age where circumnavigation seemed like a waste of time, "You're braver than I expected." I glanced up. "For attending the gathering?" "For standing in that ceremony in a white dress and not flinching." Her mouth curved slightly. "Whatever you feel on the inside, girl, your face showed nothing. That takes a particular kind of discipline." "Or practice," I said, before I could think better of it. Something in Wynne's expression shifted, a softening so brief I might have imagined it. "Yes," she said, "or practice." She let me finish the treatment in silence after that. But as I was repacking my satchel to leave, she said very casually, the way people say things they intend to be heard, "The king refused the Northern Lord's daughter 2 months ago. Before that, he refused the Ashvale Alliance proposal, and the one before that." A pause. 3 years, and he has refused every council recommendation for a formal alliance partnership. His advisors are beginning to lose patience. I fastened the buckle on my satchel. "Elder Wynne, I am a healer's representative from a border village. The king's political decisions are well outside my area of..." "I am not telling you as a political matter," Wynne said calmly. "I am telling you because I have been attending these gatherings for 40 years, and I know what a man looks like when he is waiting for something he can't name." She reached for her teacup with her newly eased arm, testing the movement with a small sound of relief. "Your work is good. Marin trained you well." She dismissed me with the serene authority of someone who had said exactly what she meant to say and needed nothing further from the conversation. I walked out of her tent into the cooling evening air and stood for a moment listening to the gathering sounds. The first fires being lit, the low percussion of drums starting somewhere near the Grafen section, the particular warmth and noise of hundreds of people settling in for the communal evening that followed every formal day at an Accord gathering. 3 years of refusals. I dismantled that thought the same way I had dismantled all the others. Carefully. Brick by brick. Replacing it with the practical and the immediate. The Harrow elder's shoulder would need a second treatment tomorrow morning. I should check on the young Ashvale warrior's blister. The evening fire would bring more minor complaints. Feet, backs, headaches from the cold ride. I had work to do. That was enough. The evening fire was lit at the center of the valley, as the last light left the sky. A great communal blaze around which the gathered packs arranged themselves in the loose, informal way of people who have set aside ceremony for the night. Food was shared across delegation lines. The drums settled into a rhythm that was old and comfortable, the kind that didn't ask anything of the people listening, just held the air in a particular way. I was tending to my third complaint of the evening, a young warrior from the Grafen pack with a headache that was almost certainly from not drinking enough water during the long day's ride, when I felt the shift in the air that I recognized now as simply what happened when Darius moved through a space. I kept my attention on my patient. "Drink the full cup," I told the young warrior, pressing the water vessel firmly into his hands. "And another after this one. The headache is from the ride and the cold air, and the fact that you are 20 years old and forgot you are not invincible. This will pass." He looked slightly affronted, which meant he was fine. I straightened, reaching for my satchel. "Ellie." The word was very quiet, barely audible over the drums and the fire and the gathered voices of 100 conversations happening simultaneously around us. It shouldn't have cut through all of that the way it did. There was no logical reason for it to land the way it did. Precise and immediate, like a hand on a shoulder. But it did. I turned. Darius stood perhaps 6 feet away, slightly apart from the nearest cluster of people, still in his formal chest plate, though he had removed the outer fur. The firelight did complicated things to his expression. Light and shadow alternating across features I had spent 3 years trying to remember less clearly than I did. He looked at me. Just that. No words beyond my name, which he had said the way you say something you have been not saying for a very long time. Around us, the gathering continued its noise. But in the small, specific radius of where we stood, everything seemed to be waiting. "Your Majesty," I said. My voice was steady. I had practiced, it turned out, for exactly this. Something moved behind his eyes at the formal address. Something quick and complicated that he controlled almost immediately. Almost. "You look," he began. And then one of his generals appeared at his shoulder, leaning in with something urgent. A dispatch, a message, the particular posture of a problem that could not wait. And the moment fractured. Darius's jaw tightened, barely perceptibly. He glanced at the general, then back at me, and I could see the exact moment when the Alpha King reasserted himself over whatever had been speaking just a second before. "We will speak," he said. Not a question, not quite a command. Something in between that I didn't have a category for. He turned away with his general, and the gathered air around us released, and I stood at the edge of the firelight holding my healer's satchel and watching him walk away. We will speak. For the first time in 3 years, I was not entirely sure I could prevent myself from wanting that, and that terrified me more than anything else had today. I did not sleep well. The tent Ashvin's council had arranged for me was small and adequate. A cot, a blanket that smelled of cedar storage, a single candle lantern that I left burning low, because the dark felt too complete without it. Outside, the gathering settled into its nighttime sounds, the distant drums finally quieting sometime past midnight, the occasional low exchange of voices from the watch rotation, the wind moving through the valley in long, considered sweeps that made the canvas walls breathe in and out like something alive. I lay on my back and listened to all of it, and did not sleep. We will speak. The words had a weight that I kept turning over, examining from different angles the way you examine something you found on a path and cannot immediately identify. Is it a stone, Is it significant? Should you carry it or set it back down? I had spent 3 years becoming very good at setting things down, at recognizing the difference between what was mine to carry and what belonged to the past, to decisions already made, to a version of myself that no longer existed in the same form. The problem was that Darius had always been difficult to set down, not because of what he was, the title, the power, the particular magnetism that came with leading 7 packs. Those things I had made my peace with relatively early. The problem was what I had seen underneath those things, in the quiet moments that formal life rarely permitted. The man who read maps alone in the library at 3 a.m, not for strategy, but because geography calmed him. The man who listened to his counsel argue for an hour before speaking a single word, not from indecision, but from the belief that hearing everything mattered. The man who had once, in the 2nd year of our marriage during a brutal winter storm that trapped the keep's entire population indoors for 4 days, sat across from me at a small table and played stones with me for 6 hours, because I had mentioned, offhandedly, that I used to play it with my father. He had not mentioned that he was terrible at it. He had lost every game with a patience that was, in retrospect, something I should have understood better. I had not understood it then. I had been too busy trying to be what the keep needed me to be. Dignified, appropriate, invisible in the right ways, visible in the others. Too busy navigating the council wives who treated me like a pleasant mistake, the advisors who spoke around me as if I were furniture, the endless performance of being adequate to a position I had never asked for, and was never quite certain I deserved. The dissolution had come at the end of the 3rd year of our marriage, delivered in terms so formal and procedural that I had not fully understood it was happening until it was already done. The official reason given to the council was incompatibility of function, a phrase so bloodlessly administrative that I had almost laughed in the chamber, and had stopped myself only because laughing seemed worse than the alternative. I had never asked him if there was a real reason. He had never offered one. And I had walked out, and kept walking, and built Ashvin around myself like a house I actually wanted to live in. But tonight, lying in the small, cedar-smelling tent with the lantern burning low, I admitted to myself, quietly, with the specific honesty that only exists at that hour when the pretenses of daytime have exhausted themselves, that I had never fully understood what had happened. That the not knowing had been the thing I'd buried deepest, under the herbs and the work and the new rhythms of a life that fit me, because looking directly at it felt like standing at the edge of something without a railing. I didn't know why he had let me go. And somehow, after today, I was no longer certain I had made peace with that the way I thought I had. Morning arrived gray and damp. A low mist settled into the valley that softened all the edges and made the gathering feel smaller, more contained. I was at my station before most of the camp had fully woken, the familiar work of setup calming the residue of a sleepless night. The Harrow Elder's second treatment was my first appointment. Wynne arrived precisely when she said she would, settled onto my table without preamble, and submitted to the treatment with the stoic efficiency of someone who respected competence above all else. She didn't mention last night's conversation. Neither did I. Sarah appeared as I was finishing, carrying 2 cups of the pine-smoked tea that had become our mutual morning ritual, and sat on the supply crate at the edge of my station, and watched the camp wake up around us with the quiet, observant air she brought to most mornings. "He asked Cale where your tent was," she said, without looking at me. I focused on repacking my kit. "When?" "Last night. Late." A pause. Cale told him. The repacking slowed slightly. I made myself continue at the same pace. "He didn't come." "No." Another pause. He stood outside it for about 3 minutes, and then walked back to his own section. I set down what was in my hands. There are moments when the careful architecture of the story you have been telling yourself, the solid, load-bearing narrative of I have healed, I have moved forward, I have built something real, develops a visible crack. Not a collapse, just a crack. A line of light coming through from the other side of something you thought was solid wall. I stood at my station in the misty morning and felt the crack widen slightly and did not know what to do about it. "Sarah," I said carefully, What am I supposed to do with that? I have absolutely no idea, she said, with the frank honesty that was her best quality. But I thought you should know. She handed me my tea. I took it. We stood together in the mist, and the camp woke around us. And I drank the bitter pine-smoked tea and tried to find the still point, and found it slightly harder to locate than usual. He found me at mid-morning. Not in the main tent, not during any formal proceeding. He found me in the small open space between the healer's section and the tree line where I had gone to gather fresh water from the stream that ran along the valley's eastern edge. It was a practical errand, unhurried, the kind of task that fills the gaps between appointments. I had my water vessel and my thoughts, and the sound of the stream and the mist. And then I had all of those things plus Darius standing on the bank 10 feet upstream. He was alone. No Kale, no generals, no procedural reason for being in this particular corner of the valley at this particular hour. He was simply there, in the mist, standing at the stream's edge with his hands at his sides and an expression on his face that I had never seen there before. I had catalogued his expressions, over 3 years of marriage, the way you catalog the expressions of someone you are trying to read and cannot fully reach. The public authority face, the listening face, the very rare, very brief face he wore when something genuinely surprised him, the closed, careful face he used with his counsel when he had already decided something and was managing the process of letting them arrive at the same conclusion. This face was none of those. This face was unguarded, uncertain in a way that sat strangely on features I associated entirely with certainty. He looked like a man who had prepared several things to say, and had arrived at the moment of saying them, and found that none of them were right. I stopped walking. The stream moved between us, shallow and cold, catching what little light the mist allowed. "I didn't know you would be here," he said. His voice was different from last night. Less controlled, the formal register slightly worn away, as if a night of poor sleep had sanded down the layers. Kale told me the healer assignment had changed, but not... He didn't tell me it was you until the tent. "I know," I said. "I'm sorry for the disruption to..." "Don't." The word was quiet but immediate. "Don't apologize for being here." I closed my mouth. He looked at the stream for a moment, then back at me. "You look well," he said. "You look..." He stopped again. Something in his jaw worked. "You look like yourself. More than you did." A pause. "At the keep." The honesty of that landed somewhere undefended and stayed there, because it was true. I had not looked like myself at the keep. I had looked like a careful, curated version of myself. The version that fit the frame the position required, that wore the right expressions at the right ceremonies, that had slowly, gradually, without fully realizing it was happening, begun to disappear inside the demands of what everyone needed her to be. Ashvin agreed with me, I said, because it was true, and because saying something true felt safer than the silence. I can see that. He was quiet for a moment. The stream moved. The mist shifted slightly, thinning where the weak sun was trying to find its way through. "I heard you've been studying with Marin. That the village relies on you." "It's a good life," I said. And I meant it. I needed him to know I meant it, that I was not diminished, that what I had built in Ashvin was real and chosen and mine. "I want you to know that. I didn't come here today carrying..." I stopped, tried again. "I'm well, Darius. Genuinely." Something passed across his face at his name in my mouth, complex and fast and not entirely hidden. "I know," he said. "I can see that too." A pause that had a different quality than the others. Heavier, as if something was being weighed in it. That should make this easier to say. I thought it would. I waited. He looked at me across the stream, in the mist, in the quiet space between the gathering behind us and the tree line ahead, and said, "I have been trying to find a way to say something to you for 3 years. I have drafted it, in my head, more times than I would like to admit. I have also told myself more times than that it was unnecessary, that the decision was correct, that you were better served by... He stopped. His hands at his sides closed briefly. I think I was wrong. The world was very still. About the decision? I asked. My voice was not entirely steady. About not explaining it. He held my gaze. You deserved an explanation. You walked out of that chamber without one. I told myself the formal proceeding had covered everything that needed to be said. And A pause. I was a coward, Ellie. In the one moment when I should have spoken plainly, I hid behind procedure, and I let you walk out without telling you the truth. The stream kept moving. Somewhere behind us, the gathering continued. Distant voices, the sound of the daily commerce of alliance and tradition. Out here in the mist, the world had narrowed to the 10 feet of water and air between us. What was the truth? I asked. He was quiet for a long moment. Then, that the council had given me a choice. Expand the alliance through a politically strategic second union, or dissolve the current one quietly and pursue the expansion through other means. They had been building toward that recommendation for 2 years. His voice was level, but something underneath it was not. I chose to dissolve the union because I told myself it was the correct strategic decision. That you would be freer. That the keep was diminishing you and I could see it, and this was... He stopped. I told myself it was for you, and I am no longer certain that was the only reason, or even the true one. The crack in my careful architecture became something larger. What do you mean? I asked very quietly. I mean that I was also afraid, he said, and I have spent 3 years being the Alpha King and refusing every alliance recommendation, and not entirely understanding why, until I saw you walk into that tent yesterday in a white dress, and I... He stopped completely for a moment. When he continued, his voice was quieter. I understood it then. The mist moved. A bird called somewhere in the pines. Darius, I said, and my voice broke slightly on it, not from grief, but from the particular difficulty of holding too many things at once. 3 years of building, 3 years of healing, 3 years of a life I genuinely loved, and this man standing in the mist telling me the thing I had spent all of that time not asking. I don't know what you want me to do with this. Nothing, he said immediately. I am not asking you for anything. I needed to say it because you deserved to hear it. Whatever you do with it is yours. He meant it. I could hear that he meant it, in the particular way I had always been able to read him even when he was being unreadable to everyone else, and that, the fact that he meant it, the absence of agenda behind it, was somehow the most disarming thing he could have said. I stood at the stream's edge in the mist, and felt the weight of 3 years pressing against the weight of this moment, and did not know, for the first time in a very long time, what came next. I stood at that stream for a long time after he left. He had not waited for my response, not because he was indifferent to it. I understood that now, but because he had meant what he said. He was not asking for anything. He had crossed the distance to say the true thing, and then stepped back from it, leaving it entirely in my hands, which was either the most generous thing he had ever done, or the most difficult, and I could not immediately tell which. The mist continued its slow withdrawal as the morning aged, the weak sun finally finding enough conviction to burn through, and I stood at the stream with my water vessel and my thoughts and the sound of the cold water moving over stones. And I let myself feel, without managing it, without immediately building architecture around it, all of it at once. The anger was there. I had not known it was still there until this moment, not as the sharp and urgent thing it had been in the first months after the dissolution, but in its quieter, older form, the low ember of it, the residue of having been made a procedural decision rather than a person, of having been dissolved like a clause in a contract, while the real reason sat unspoken in a chamber full of men who thought strategy was the same thing as truth. The grief was there too, not the acute grief that had passed, worked through in small pieces during long evenings in Ashvin, when the work was done, and the cottage was quiet, and there was nothing to do but sit with what remained. This was the settled, permanent kind of grief. The kind that doesn't destroy you, but doesn't fully leave either. That becomes simply part of the landscape of who you are. And underneath both of those things, persistent and unwelcome, and entirely real, something else. Something that had been sitting in the locked room I had built for it 3 years ago, and had now, in the space of one misty morning conversation, discovered the door was not as secure as I had believed. I carried my water vessel back to my station. I worked through the morning's appointments with the focus that had never failed me. 3 more patients before the midday meal, each one receiving my complete and genuine attention. Because whatever was happening in my interior life, the work was real, and the people were real, and that did not change. A child's fever, slight and manageable, reassured into a cooler compress and rest. An elder's back, eased with careful pressure and the warming salve. A young female warrior from the Ashvale pack who had twisted her ankle and was furious about it and needed both physical treatment and the particular service of being spoken to as a capable person who was temporarily inconvenienced rather than an invalid. I gave her both, and she left walking carefully but with her dignity intact, which seemed to matter more to her than the pain. Sarah watched me work and said nothing, and refilled my tea twice, and was, as always, exactly what was needed without being asked. The midday meal was communal, long tables arranged in the open air as the mist had fully cleared, leaving the valley washed and bright under a pale winter sun. I sat with Sarah and the young Ashvale healer, whose name, I had learned, was Penn, and who had relaxed considerably since the previous morning, and turned out to have an unexpectedly dry wit, and ate warm stew and dark bread, and listened to the conversation around me without fully entering it. I was aware of Darius at the head table, the way I had been aware of him all morning, the way I suspected I would always be aware of him in any shared space, not as a disruption, but as a fact, the way you are aware of the direction of north even when you are not consulting it. He was speaking with Kale and one of the Eastern delegates, his attention apparently complete and present, the Alpha King fully inhabiting the role. But twice, in the natural course of a meal and a conversation, his gaze moved across the gathered tables and found mine for a beat that was 1 beat longer than accident. I did not look away either time. Penn said something about the Ashvale Pack's new training protocols. Sarah responded with a question about Northern Pack healer networks. I contributed a comment about Marin's documentation methods. The conversation moved, and I was part of it, genuinely part of it. And I was also sitting with the thing Darius had said at the stream, turning it over and over like a smooth stone. I told myself it was for you, and I am no longer certain that was the only reason. Here was what I knew, sitting in the winter sun with warm stew and honest company. I had built something in Ashvin that was real. The life I had there, the cottage, the work, Marin's teaching, the rhythms of a small community that had made room for me and that I had made room for in return. That was not a consolation prize. That was not a lesser version of something else. That was a life, fully inhabited, genuinely mine, built from my own choices and my own hands, and the slow, difficult work of becoming someone I recognized. I would not trade it, not for anything. But here was also what I knew. The not knowing had cost me something. The 3 years of carrying the dissolution without an explanation, of building my peace on top of an unanswered question, of telling myself I had made peace with something I had actually simply buried, that had been its own kind of weight. And hearing the truth, even a truth that was complicated and imperfect, and came from a man who had, by his own admission, been a coward in the moment that mattered, had shifted something, not broken it, shifted it. Like a window, finally opened in a room that had been closed for too long. I found him in the late afternoon. This was not planned. Or perhaps it was, in the way that things you have been circling for hours become inevitable. Not a decision so much as an arrival at the place your feet were always going to take you. He was in the small northern section of the gathering grounds, away from the main activity, standing at the edge of a rise that looked out over the valley from above. The afternoon light was going golden and long, the shadows stretching across the valley floor in the way they do in late winter when the sun is already thinking about leaving. He had his back to me when I approached, and he did not turn, but the set of his shoulders told me he knew I was there. I stopped beside him, not close. A foot of air between us, the appropriate distance. The distance of two people who were something to each other that didn't have a clean current name. We looked at the valley together. The gathering was winding toward its final evening. Tomorrow morning the accord would be formally signed, the delegations would begin their journeys home, and this particular confluence of people and purpose would dissolve back into the separate lives it had briefly gathered. Below us, the cook fires were being prepared for the last communal meal. The sound of it was warm and distant, that particular quality of noise that becomes almost musical when you hear it from high enough above. "I owe you an apology," I said. Not because he had asked, because it was true and I had been sitting with it all afternoon. Not for Ashvin, I would not take that back, but for the 3 years of silence. You wrote twice in the first months. I didn't respond. You didn't owe me responses. No, but I think I was punishing you with the silence, and I didn't admit that to myself until today. I paused. That wasn't fair. He was quiet for a moment. Then, I wrote things in those letters that I should have said in the chamber. I knew, sending them, that it was too late for that to be what it should have been. I don't blame you for the silence. I know. But I'm saying it anyway. He turned his head to look at me, and I turned mine to look at him, and we were close enough that I could see the specific quality of the afternoon light in his eyes, that gray blue that I had spent 3 years trying to remember less precisely than I did, and neither of us looked away. "What happens now?" I asked, not with hope inflected into it, not with expectation, just the genuine question. He was quiet long enough that I knew he was giving it the weight it deserved rather than answering quickly. That was one of the things I had always trusted about him, even when I couldn't trust other things. The way he refused to respond to real questions with easy answers. "I think," he said slowly, "that you go back to Ashvin, and I go back to Veldrath, and we know what we know now." A pause. "Which is more than we knew before." "Yes," I said, "it is." "And I think," he continued more carefully, "that if the healer's representative of Ashvin Village were willing, the Crown might have cause to request a formal consultation with Marin's practice regarding the Eastern Border Territory's medical resources." He held my gaze. "Which would require correspondence, regular correspondence, between the Keep's administration and the Ashvin station." I looked at him for a long moment. "That is a very elaborate bureaucratic framework," I said, "for asking if we can write letters." Something moved across his face, quick and genuine, and so unexpected that it took me a moment to name it. He almost smiled. Not the formal public version. The real one. The one I had seen perhaps a dozen times in 3 years of marriage and had never quite prepared for. "I am the Alpha King," he said. "I work with the tools I have." I looked back at the valley. The golden light was deepening toward amber, and below us the cook fires were brightening as the sky darkened at its edges, and the sound of the gathering drifted up to where we stood, warm and human, and full of the noise of lives being lived alongside each other. "Marin will need to approve any formal correspondence arrangement," I said. "She is extremely particular about administrative channels." "I would expect nothing less." "And I will not be—" I stopped, gathered the right words. "I am not the person I was at the Keep, Darius. I will not be that again. Whatever this is, whatever it becomes, I bring Ashvin with me. I bring who I have become. That is not negotiable." "I know," he said. And then, very quietly, "I would not want the other version. I would not have known how to say that 3 years ago. I know how to say it now." The amber light held us both for a moment. The valley below moved and breathed and carried on. "Then write the letter," I said. 3 weeks later, a formal document arrived at Marin's practice in Ashfen. Carefully worded, officially stamped, requesting a consultation arrangement regarding Eastern Border Territory medical resources. Marin read it twice, set it down, looked at me over the top of her reading spectacles with the expression of a woman who had seen enough of life to not be surprised by any of it, and said, "Well, I suppose you'd better draft the response." I sat down at the small desk in the corner of the practice and picked up a pen and looked at the blank page for a long moment. Then I began to write. Not carefully, not in the curated, managed way I had once written everything at Veldrath Keep. Every word weighed for appropriateness, every sentence shaped to fit the frame of what was expected. I wrote the way I had learned to do everything in Ashfen, directly, from the actual place inside me where the true things lived, without apology for taking up space on the page. The correspondence continued, through the remainder of that winter, and into the first weeks of spring. Letters that began formally and became gradually something else. The natural evolution of two people who had things to say and had finally, after 3 years, found the channel to say them through. Marin read none of them. She didn't need to. She simply continued her work and watched me move through mine and said nothing, except once in early spring when she looked up from her herb sorting and observed, "You're sleeping better." "Yes," I said. "Good," she said, and went back to her sorting. In late spring, Darius came to Ashfen. Not with ceremony, not with a formal delegation. He came with Kale and 2 quiet guards, and the particular unpretentious traveling clothes of someone who was not arriving as the Alpha King, but as a person with somewhere specific he needed to be. He arrived on a Tuesday morning when the village was in the middle of its ordinary business, and he walked through it with the careful, attentive manner of someone encountering a place that matters, rather than a place that should be impressed. I met him at the edge of the practice, in the herb garden. Marin and I tended together, where the first spring growth was coming up in the beds, the bright, stubborn green of new things deciding to exist. He stood at the garden's edge and looked at it, then at the practice, then at me. And I watched him take in the thing I had built and see it, genuinely see it, without agenda, without the frame of what it meant for anything else. "It suits you," he said. "I know," I said. We walked through the village, just the 2 of us, while Kale sat with studied patience in Marin's front room and drank tea and pretended he was not enormously relieved by the entire situation. We walked the path along the eastern stream and through the market and up to the ridge where on clear days you could see the far edge of the Veldrath Territory's tree line, blue-gray in the distance. We talked. The way we had never quite managed to talk in 3 years of marriage, without performance, without the watching eyes of counsel and expectation, without either of us managing what the other person needed to see. We talked about the Eastern Territory disputes he was navigating, about Marin's methods for pain management in old joint damage, which genuinely interested him in the way maps and governance interested him, as systems, as problems with elegant solutions. About Penn, the young Ashvale healer who had written to me twice since the gathering, and was turning into, I suspected, a real colleague. About the particular quality of silence in Ashfen on winter mornings. About the 12-year-old version of himself who had first been told he would rule and had understood, in that moment, that loneliness was the price of it, and had accepted that price, and then spent decades pretending he had not found the cost higher than expected. That last one came out late in the afternoon, on the ridge, with the spring wind coming down from the north and the distant tree line holding its blue-gray patience on the horizon. He said it the way he said things when the Alpha King had been set down for a moment, quietly, without decoration, as a simple fact. I said, "You don't have to pay it forever." He looked at me. "That price," I said, "it was set by a 12-year-old who didn't know yet that there were other options. You're allowed to renegotiate." He was quiet for a long moment, looking at the horizon. Then he said, "I'm working on it." And that, I understood, was the truest thing either of us had said. He did not stay in Ashfen long. 3 days, managed carefully, respectfully, nothing that disrupted the fabric of the life I had built there. He attended to no formal business. He helped Marin carry supply crates from the storage room to the practice without being asked, because he arrived at the practice on the second morning, as she was attempting to do it alone, and simply picked them up, and Marin looked at him for a moment, and then looked at me with the expression of a woman revising a previously held opinion. On the third morning, before he left, he stood in the herb garden in the early light, and I stood beside him, and the garden smelled of damp earth and new growth, and the particular sharp sweetness of the first spring herbs coming up. "The correspondence arrangement," he said. "I'd like to continue it. So would I. And I'd like—" He paused, in the way he paused when he was being careful with something important. "I would like to come back, when it's welcome, at whatever pace makes sense." He held my gaze. "I am not asking to reclaim anything. Ellie, I am asking if I may know you. The person you are now. On the terms that belong to who you are now." I thought about the cottage and the herb garden, and Marin's sharp eyes and Sarah's shoulder against mine, and Penn's letters and the ridge and the winter mornings and everything I had built, and chosen, and become. I thought about the stream in the valley mist, and the crack in the careful wall, and the still point that had been, for 3 years, mine alone. "Yes," I said. "You may." What followed was not a sudden return, or a dramatic restoration. It was something slower and more honest than either of those things. A patient reconstruction, built from correspondence and visits and the kind of unhurried presence that neither of us had managed when we were young and frightened and performing versions of ourselves for an audience that never stopped watching. By autumn, his visits to Ashfen had become known and unremarkable. The Alpha King who came to the eastern border village without ceremony, and sat in the healer's garden and was, to all visible evidence, simply a man who had somewhere he wanted to be. The council raised concerns. Cale managed them with the serene competence of a man who had waited 3 years for exactly this outcome, and was not about to let procedural objections derail it. Marin said, "Once, at the end of a long workday, when we were cleaning the practice together in the particular comfortable silence of 2 people who have run out of things that need to be said, he looks at this place the way you looked at it when you first arrived, like something he didn't know existed but immediately understood." "Yes," I said. "That's worth something," she said. "I know," I said. She handed me a bundle of dried lavender to hang, and went back to her work, and I stood with the lavender in my hands, and smelled the sharp, familiar sweetness of it, and thought about all the versions of me this year had held. The woman who had walked into a valley in a white dress not knowing what the day would bring. The woman at the stream in the mist. The woman on the ridge with the spring wind in her hair. The woman who had picked up a pen and written directly and without apology from the true place inside her. All of them were me. All of them had built this. And this. The herb garden in the autumn light. The smell of lavender. The sound of Marin moving through her work in the next room. The letter on the desk in the corner waiting to be answered. This was enough. More than enough. This was, at last, exactly right.